everyone. We're just waiting for Jason and Tarzan. So to running slightly shortly. There's an in-person. Good morning, Alice. There's an in-person kind of coffee and breakfast. So if you might want to just kind of get a coffee yourselves wherever you might be. And I think we'll start soon.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah, hi, Dagmar.
I'm not familiar how to toggle now between this and then the other review. Are we just moving from this to another room, Zoom review? Is that because I can't open it up? There's something strange going on when I'm trying to look at the other invitation.
Yes, we're going to post when we're finished with Jason's introduction. We'll repost the links for whether you're in group 4 or group 5. And the problem is it's hard to have more than one
Welcome, everyone. We seem to have quite a few people in the waiting room, so I'm just going to let everyone in before we get started. For your reference, this session is being recorded, and also for the benefit of students who may not be able to join us on Zoom, we've also provided a live stream of just this session on YouTube. As you see on the background behind me, we have 3 projects this morning from Studio Dwyer, and then my studio, and then from Rakatansky's studio. Hello, Catherine.
Good morning, Michael.
I think we're just waiting on Mark to sign in. Then we can start together, if that's all right. Let's see. Here we go. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Michael.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for joining us at this very strange remote Saturday Distinguished Project Review. As you see in the background, we have our lineup and also the names of the students we're featuring for this morning. And then on the other side, you'll see the names of our specially invited guests. And as Jason mentioned, if it's all right, perhaps I can ask the guest jurors to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with Professor Dwyer's student. With that in mind, perhaps I can just go through, if you can see. Let's see, oh yes, Dora, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, thank you. Good morning. I am Dora Epstein-Jones, zooming in from Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. Yes, we have architecture out here. And I want to extend a special thank you to Dean Harris and to Jason Lee and to Catherine and all of the people at Pratt who have invited me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. And then we also have Ruth Burkhold.
Hi, everybody. I'm in Germany at the moment, and it's the afternoon for me. I haven't been at Pratt in 2 years. I have a little practice in New York, and I miss everybody very dearly. So it's great to be with you today. Thank you so much. My office is called Yes Architecture, and I hope to see you soon again in real life.
Thank you. And Henry, would you please as well?
Sure. Hi, I'm Henry Grossman. I'm an architect, formerly of New York City, but I'm now coming to you from northern New Mexico. So Dora, I guess we're like neighbors. I'm in Santa Fe. Yeah.
Thank you. And next, Zeri Wang, who's also a former graduate of Pratt Institute, actually, recently graduated from Princeton University.
That's right. Hi, everyone. My name is Zeri Wang. I'm zooming in from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Currently, I'm conducting my doctoral work at Penn. It's it's a pure delight to be here, and thank you for the department to invite me for this special occasion.
Thank you, Zeri. Then we have Zikon Liu.
I'm the student selected from Mark's studio that presenting today. And it's my honor to be selected at this time, and thank you.
And then we also have Katie Kwok.
Hi, I'm Katie, and I'm from Michael's studio.
And then next on my list is Ashkan.
Hi, this is Ashkan. I'm the student from Catherine Dwyer's studio.
Thank you. And then I guess, let's see. I think that's all. Sabrina? I wonder if she...
Hi, I'm just here to support Ashkan and Katie as they present. Good luck, guys.
Thank you very much. I hope that was it for the introductions. In that case, perhaps then we can transition to Catherine. If you'd like to introduce your studio.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And thanks to everybody for being here on a Saturday morning. It's a really exciting opportunity for the students to get a secondary critique and also a much wider audience for their work. So thank you for that. The studio that Ashkan participated in this semester is called Landscape Imaging, Formations, and the Climate Crisis. And for background, I'm a landscape architect and I teach within the School of Architecture degree project in the core sequence in the second year, and also advanced studios like this one, which I would say is closer to a landscape studio, but of course, because many of these students are taking landscape for the first time, it's a real hybrid experience and a fantastic one for me. So the studio had a dual focus, starting with an experimentation with a variety of landscape imaging and modeling strategies, including 3D point cloud capture, photogrammetry, and GIS skills, and then deployment of those skills toward site analysis and site interpretation. They also played with a lot of analog materials, which you'll see as well, toward the development of morphological, material, cultural, and ecological research into the landscape formation that they chose to investigate. And the idea was really to begin to think about the development of an architectural proposal that's asking questions about how we might live and situate ourselves within the fissile context of the climate crisis and the demand it puts upon us for new thinking. And so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Ashkan to show you his project.
Thank you, Catherine, for the introduction. So again, my name is Ashkan. At any point in this presentation, if there's GIFs or videos that are choppy, you can. They're all available on Miro. The project that I'll be presenting is sited on the Newtown Creek, so I'm going to start by talking about the site conditions for a little bit. So Newtown Creek is designated as one of the most polluted waterways in the nation by the EPA. And this pollution is due to the industrial history of this waterway that was occupied by heavy industries, primarily the oil industry around which this neighborhood initially formed. This image shows the effects of urban development around the creek and changing the edge condition of the creek from a soft, marshy condition here to a harder edge, which is characterized by retaining walls, piers, and riprapps. So this area around the creek is currently an M3 designated zone, shown here in gray. This zoning is for areas with heavy industries that generate noise, traffic, and pollutants. Typical uses include power plants, solid waste transfer facilities, and recycling plants. Around the M3 zone, the lighter gray shows the zoning designation for lighter industries with low pollutants and noise. And immediately adjacent to this M1 zone is a residential zoning that formed in the mid-19th century to house the people who worked in these industries. And currently there's a number of oil refineries here shown in white, as well as these waste processing facilities around the creek. And interestingly, this one in bold purple shows that Charles Pratt, the founder of Pratt Institute, was an owner of a refinery that was operational starting in 1876, which 7 years later, it became part of the John Rockefeller's Standard Oil Organization. Standard Oil, along with ExxonMobil and KM, were all responsible for the oil plume that contaminates the sites to this day. And so these are some of the images from the site, and they begin to like form this aesthetic that I was really interested in working with. And sorry. Okay. The site is contaminated by human activities. Do you still see my screen? Okay. The site is contaminated by, sorry. The site is contaminated by human activities that layer on top of each other, turning it into a scene. There are footages that show the theatrics of the anthropogenic processes as industries change or move out of these spaces, and new ones will replace them. This speaks to an urban phenomenon where the place that was once the periphery is moving towards the urban center. What was once considered unpleasant and peripheral is now inevitably ingrained in the urban fabric. So this project, in a way, responds to mechanics of the site and the layers of human geology that have been deposited on the site since the industrialization of this part of the Brooklyn in the mid-19th century. Now I would like to shift the gears a little bit and set the framework for the project that I'm about to present. The approach to this design project can fit into the definition of speculative fabulation, which was termed by Donna Haraway as a method of storytelling in which the sharpness of reality is blurred by the author to allow for the reader to imagine new meanings. Storytelling in this context is key. Storytelling is a method of world making, and the world that this project constructs through storytelling is a commentary on the one characterized by the anthropogenic crises that have relied on narratives of world as a resource, nature as external, and progress as an escape from nature's determinations and limits. And of course, of technology as a quasi-autonomous prime mover, in the words of Christophe Bernard. I consider this narrative-based design as an alternative to functional design because its purpose is not as much to provide an artifact with a certain purpose and program to sit out there in its site, but it is more about raising awareness and becoming a means for nurturing new habits and projecting alternative forms of organizing one's relationship to the earth. Earlier this semester, I started to examine natural processes and extract a number of formal operations, which I then began to hybridize this formal language with the tectonic industrial language of the site to arrive to this matrix. This helped me establish a conceptual framework that questions the notion of nature as an external entity and advocates what is constructed as its own new form of standing reserve in nature. So, in a way, this project aims to speculate through these images on the kinds of landscapes that will emerge as the current uncompensated exploitation, production, and consumption of the planet as a resource continue, and as well as what El-Hadi Jazairi of Design Earth calls the designated erasure of productive hinterlands and waste landfills from a predominantly city-centric outlook that abstracts the materialities of urban networks and leaves out the associated externalities that accompany the development of such technologies, such as the rhizomatic network of the infrastructure that populates below the very ground we're sitting on right now. So the future that this project occupies is characterized by hyper-consumerism that has tremendously increased the amount of waste that is produced. And we can no longer afford to delegate the waste into remote landfills out of sight. Waste processing is now inevitably ingrained in the urban fabric, and the theatrics of waste processing begin to populate the urban stage. The idea of waste is then expanded into to include the non-tangible byproducts of mechanical processes such as heat, odor, noise, alongside the familiar bottles, cans, and compost. Titled Uber Machine, this project is a land manufactory. It is a literal interpretation of the idea of Jardin en Mouvement, or the moving garden by Gilles Clément. this theory of the moving garden emphasizes the autonomy of nature in the design of gardens that require minimum maintenance. In the mechanical moving garden that I'll be presenting, the machine is understood as part of what we have come to know as nature, and therefore, kind of like nature has its own agency. So the Uber machine is essentially a proposal for a reconfiguration and reuse of the existing infrastructure at the abandoned KM oil refinery. The project grows on the site right by the Newtown Creek and expands over the entire lot of this former terminal, sitting on many layers of geology. And in this case, geology goes beyond the naturally occurring strata to include the human activity, and that's something I was trying to represent in this experimental model. But it does include traces of the human activity that sit in this site, along with the industrial past, such as the machinery that is left on the site, contamination, and the urban sub-infrastructure. So this polypotent machine uses processes of automation to process waste, composting, and recycling while decontaminating the ungraved contaminated soil. The clean treated soil that is now a precious, scarce resource is stored in the former oil tanks and distributed into the mechanical planters, where it is used to grow non-native vegetation in the microclimates produced as a result of the excess heat from the waste processing and recycling. This opens up opportunities for growing produce that is otherwise grown, handled, packed, and shipped from remote countries where labor is cheap and climate is suitable, which consequently incurs extreme energy costs and climate issues. The project also opens up a discourse about moving towards the hyperlocal ground, particularly in a profane urban environment. The world in which the project sits is characterized by an architectural definition of nature that rejects the notion of the pristine and advocates the inclusion of what is constructed by the society as its own new form of standing reserve in nature. So in a way, the Uber machine becomes an uncomfortable entanglement of nature, machine, and waste that provokes the human occupant, which in this case is a passive spectator, to rethink their pre-established relationship with the earth, land, or what we've come to know as nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashkan.
I'll go ahead and just start us off with a little bit. Thank you, Ashkan. This is really provocative on lots of levels. Is the site first a question? Can you tell us a little bit more about the history of this site? Is this a designated Superfund site? Like, what's the sort of background here?
Yeah, so it actually is a designated Superfund. I might be wrong, but I think that this is one of the largest designated Superfund sites in the nation. But it, starting in the mid 19th century, a lot of oil industries began to occupy these sites that were by then the periphery, and there was not a lot of residentials or activity happening around this area. So they started to form in this area, and it was primarily the primary occupants or workers were white immigrants, especially Polish. So as they began to populate these industries, they started to form their residentials, and to this day, it is known as a very Polish neighborhood. The contamination is, of course, a big part of it because by then it was kind of unchecked. So not only were there a lot of sewage overflows, the combined sewage overflows, but also contaminations because of the industries that are mostly dealing with toxins and pollutants.
I feel like the presentation kind of took a turn that I liked very much, where initially I thought it was going to be completely about the sort of movement of the landscape and the machine in a way that was maybe refreshingly free of a desire to, let's say, remediate some sort of condition or conditions that exist in the site. And then it turned, and it actually became completely about the sort of environmental conditions that are there, but in a way that I find really interesting, because it's in some ways so counterintuitive the way you've done it, or almost contrarian, which I like. I know that area very well. I lived in Long Island City before I moved to northern New Mexico for like 20 years. And in Greenpoint, it's like you're not even allowed to grow vegetables in your backyard, which you actually have because the soil was so contaminated. So the idea of a machine that produces ground, as opposed to, let's say, dealing with water, which, so many projects on the site often do, is very, very refreshing. And then the idea of like the production of a habitat for non-native plants, I find sort of so provocative and amazing. It's a really, really smart take on that site. The thing where I actually start to sort of question what you're saying versus what I'm seeing is, like when you showed that it's sort of one very, very beautiful image and talked about how it's not about pristineness. I have a hard time taking you at your word there, because there is a kind of beauty and sort of fetishization of the machine. And I'm about to ask you a totally unfair question. But it actually seems like a lot of the processes that you're talking about, like in terms of producing soil, for example, are actually super low tech. And like, do they really require the kind of level of infrastructure that the images that you're showing seem to suggest? Like, how much of that machine is actually required by this sort of soil production agenda and habitat production agenda? And how much of it is just about a kind of sort of beautiful new idea of landscape? And I mean that as a totally like honest question, not like some sort of like, I don't know, sharp critique. Because that to me is the thing that I don't, I'm trying to figure out where you position the project.
Yeah. So my answer to that, well, the machinery is not just for the vegetation. It's essentially a waste processing facility, and the heat that is resultant from the waste processing is what helps with the soil. So a lot of the machinery goes into that. But the more honest answer question is that I don't know what kind of machinery is needed for these processes.
Yeah, no, like fair enough. Like I get the heat thing, and that's super smart, but like, it's like a compost tumbler produces heat, right? And it's pretty simple,
right?
And the level of machinery that you're showing, like a lot of it sort of looks like a lot of, let's say, like the sort of Greenpoint, the sewage treatment plant, and the and I think it's okay to not maybe sort of not understand like what level of machinery or like, let's say, what the images of the machinery actually do, but then maybe it opens up a space where you can sort of be honest about a kind of aesthetic agenda. Because, like I don't have a problem with that aesthetic agenda. At first I thought the project was going to be all about that. And then it turned in a way that was a sort of like very smart kind of environmental agenda, for lack of a better term. But I guess I'm curious then how you sort of tie that back to what I think is clearly an aesthetic agenda. Just maybe not.
Yeah,
quite
think,
the right word.
sorry. I think
No,
this,
no,
this is a great observation. And you know, and I think it, for me, it would suffice for him to talk about, say, the what's now almost a tradition of the machine in the garden kind of aesthetic, and you know, and to use that and to build on that, because you know, I mean, it's machine in the garden aesthetic is a much more kind of localized aesthetic than the aesthetic of the kind of overwhelming infrastructural industrial, heavy industrial look that is permeating through, you know, your documentation. But I think that, and my question I would add to this, that and I think it's fine to own the machine and the garden aesthetic. I think it's perfectly reasonable, especially in a speculative fabulation, to talk about that. But what I would add to this, though, is that there is a question of scale that I think is really important in this project, and one which is clearly trying to get past the overwhelming or sublime of the American technological infrastructural landscape, which is great. You know, I'd rather have the machine, I suppose, you know, the choose the machine in the garden versus the sublime. No, take the machine in the garden kind of sublime instead. But what I wonder about, though, is I wonder about the microscopic level, the proliferation of contamination. You have a tendency to use neat corners, even in the geological sample thing, you know, concept model that you made, to use, you know, orthogonal angles, you know, and so forth, or to use a boundary on the site as if, you know, contamination were so neat. I imagine that the Polish immigrants in the area and the people who've lived there for however long probably have really high cancer rates. I think there's probably a lot of environmental injustice that goes on in this area, which speaks to the molecular level at which, you know, these contaminants happen. And so I think what I'd like to see is just, I'd also like to see maybe a little bit more, and this comes back to this kind of, you know, aesthetic question, I suppose. The way you represent this idea is not just machine in the garden, but machine and garden are both a techne, you know, and a techne that is subject to the ordinances of, you know, human geometric perception. And I think that there's probably, you mentioned something being a little bit more rhizomatic, but I think you're still thinking about pipes. I'm thinking about leakage, right? You know, and I think that there's probably a way to describe the misbehavior of contamination and the way in which, you know, leaching contamination is going to take putting tendrils out into the world that don't obey right angles, that don't, you know, that aren't also easily contained. And so I think that there's probably a way in this project to get at, you know, that kind of that level of seepage, and you know, that is occurring. I really liked in one of the drawings how you just have this like pepper almost at the bottom of the drawing, and that pepper to me is I think saying a little bit more than the angle and the container and so forth. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. It's a great project, and you know, and I'll ask you one more question, which follows up on Henry's. Is it meant to be prototypical? Like there would be many of these floating around?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So the way that the site is set up, I'm using everything that is available in this boundary, but also, there's a lot of other oil refineries that have the similar infrastructure. So yes, if they were to be used, they could be used in the same or a similar way.
There's a certain extent to which, some of these projects are calling on us to recolonize Earth. Forget about colonizing Mars or something like that. Let's recolonize the territory that that we've already colonized for something that is more mutually, say, beneficial or frankly, life-saving on this planet, right? And so I'd love to see what that would look like across that site if as these things proliferate.
Right.
I don't mind jumping in. That's all right. Hello. I know it's a bit scary when deans show up, isn't it? Gosh, I hope I'm not annoying. But I just really appreciate the comments we've heard from other jurors, and I thought I might riff off their wisdom. So first of all, I'm really impressed by this project. I do think that designing for other species besides humans, but also with other species materially is a really good strategy. And in some ways, I was getting excited about the possibility of plant matter being part of your infrastructures rather than what Siegfried Gideon would otherwise find entirely fascistic, because it really does riff off his mechanization takes command thesis. So just a word of caution about, I think, making more use perhaps of organic matter as part of the architectural infrastructure. But I did really appreciate if you like, the kind of really intellectual thought that you've gone into over what constitutes non-native. And I find it fascinating because, in New York, we don't really know what non-native is anymore. We've had the temperature rise about 3 degrees since 1970. And of course, it's getting hotter all the time. It's affecting when seasons start and finish. And it's also meaning that species are migrating north. So we also have, as a diasporan city, an ignored First Peoples who have, regional planting, if you like, a heritage planting strategy of their own. But then, of course, with so many communities from all around the world here, and with us, if you like, the physical, anthropological needs that we all have relative to certain foodstuffs, some stuff is aggravating to our systems because of our, genetic makeup, and others not so much. But indigeneity as a planting strategy is, quite a challenging thesis. So I think, this contesting what native vegetation is good. I think it's kind of necessary and inevitable. But I also think that, what I was really hoping for was images perhaps that showed, maybe some decontamination plants, because, some plants are really effective at what they call phytomediation, which is essentially a decontamination. So one of the things that one might consider is what plants are necessary to decontaminate the site. And then after that, what plants could perhaps be toggled to what we know to be enormous issues within the city, such as food insecurity. And that could be where, relative to the communities surrounding Newtown Creek, one could bring back in, if you like, some sensitivity to the genetic makeup of those communities who are lacking in affordable, healthy food. And that could be something that could be directly addressing their needs. But I think that one should always, with mechanical strategies, be mindful of the kind of inclination all architects suffer, which is to divert into techno-utopianism. I think that it's sometimes necessary, but I think what you do when you end up with these machinic components is you need to be able to kind of justify them by thinking more about how do you make them autonomous. And the interesting thing about Newtown Creek, of course, is that it's got between, I think, a 3.5 foot to 5.5 foot tidal range. So that effectively becomes a kind of hydraulic system that could, be part of a power strategy that could make these bits of infrastructure autonomous, because they wouldn't rely on a grid or anything, or any electric being plugged into the mainframe electrics, which is also a good way of thinking about it. But just more generally, questions of what constitutes, I think, heritage. It's a really interesting site, isn't it? You've tapped into the fact that Pratt's got some restorative justice work to do around this site, and it's multiple. It's not just about using a planting strategy to decontaminate it, but again, also symbolically, what does that do in terms of bringing back other species and the interdependencies of species that have actually moved further north. So you've got this far more complex hybrid condition. And I think before I go much further, I just want to say, as you can see from my response, you're touching on something that has the integrity of a far more advanced thesis than undergraduate architecture. So I just want to commend you for that. Don't see what I'm necessarily saying as a criticism. I think similarly with the other reviewers' feedback, it's that the project that you've produced has so much integrity that we're able to see the possibilities of it, as an expanded thesis. something you might want to kind of really invest in, in the next iteration of your studio, or even, perhaps in your academic writing. So that's just my 2 pence, as I might say, from my region. But I thought it was really impressive. And again, this idea of, coming back to this point that I mentioned a moment ago, but really the shift between not having one kind of planting strategy, but thinking about the way that you could, present in some ways this shift from decontamination planting into rehabilitation and food poverty planting, or whatever it is, and also being sensitive to the fact that all plants have, the potential, they have to work in some form of interactive ecology. That's really what ecologies are. So I think that, I think about other forms of species besides planting, and, other animals and creatures that are dependent on plants beside human beings. That's also, I think, very much part of your latent narrative. So overall, really fantastic. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Yama. I think I just want to take a slight detour here about the symbolism of nature, and how nature has actually been used as a means or as a way of rehabilitating, but also it should be noted that nature has also been used as a way of erasure, in terms of erasing history and hiding things, and the notion that if you plant over things and if you mix the garden and the machine, somehow the machine becomes more friendly, or more humane, or more at peace with nature, is something that we have to grapple with. And it's relatively recent that we realize that nature taking over certain sites has actually not just been a kind of an innocent natural pattern of the environment taking over, but it's actually been welcomed by certain groups and certain sort of cultures as a way of erasing memory also. I say this in not as a critique of this, but because this actually proposes a very different paradigm. So there are sites, for example, Holocaust sites, cemeteries that have actually been let wild, if you will, to kind of be taken over by nature, and it's a way of actually hiding what's underneath it. And what is sort of the kind of the history or the legacy of what had happened there before. So the notion that nature is this soft, warm, welcoming, and rehabilitating sort of approach is a good one, and there's nothing wrong with it. But we should also acknowledge that it can be used, and its symbolism can be used as a way of hiding the kind of the mechanism or the machinery underneath. So for me, this is kind of a interesting dichotomy where the machine and the vegetation are present at once. That the kind of the mechanism and the machine behind this nature are omnipresent and kind of working in conjunction with one another. But I do want to kind of highlight that just because things are green, just because things are grown in wild, doesn't necessarily symbolize rebirth or symbolize rehabilitation. That we should be more cognizant of its use. And so, yes, the project's amazing, extremely skillful, very sophisticated, but we should look at it also in a kind of a broader spectrum.
I actually think he did. I don't want to take up too much space, but there was one thing that he said that was almost offhand about the sort of non-native and the sort of new like subtropical microclimate being produced as being able to grow produce that's normally produced in countries with which he said, lower, much lower wages, and B, also to pick up on something that Dean said, a history of in-migration to the United States and to New York. And I actually think that's the moment when the project could take yet another turn and become really, really interesting. And to start to deal with issues of, like, I don't know, like deal with the history of the banana, and imperialism, and like what it would mean to start to grow bananas in Brooklyn. And in some ways, in that image that I talked about before, I'm kind of much more taken by the like palm trees than I am the the machine. And I wish that the sort of non-native, like the non-native aspect of the project, I think is starting to have all sorts of really interesting implications that I think could be amplified if the project were developed further or presented differently, that I think would address some of the things you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe I can chime in a little bit as well. I guess one thing I really appreciate about this particular project is that, it seems like the project is imagining a different way for us to belong to the land and formulate a kind of completely different relationship. So I guess, since we have the agency, I guess, of kind of speculative fabulation, I'm actually much more curious about the kind of the politics of the kind of the aesthetics you are producing. Do you envision this kind of speculation as something for us, right? Like those people who are kind of left with contaminated land, and for us to somehow regain a new sense of belonging to the land? Or do you see this as a kind of a speculation to think about, to use it as a kind of a cautionary tale? So I guess I'm curious about kind of like, how do you position your project like politically in that regards as part of the aesthetics production?
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, in a way, these pollutions are something that are happening in a lot of places at different paces. So if we go far enough into the future, then we're all in the same boat. Like there's going to be pollution in everywhere, and climate change is going to like change a lot of things. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I guess this is one thing I'm kind of really curious about, is like how do you, like, who is the speculation for, and how is that help us orient ourselves in this kind of anthropocentric era we're living in? And I think that's something that's quite that's important to reconcile. I mean, I don't have a clear answer for you, I think, but I think the kind of the political dimension is quite important to kind of push for during the aesthetics kind of exploration here as well.
I want to contribute a little bit more on here, which is that that unlike the kind of cautionary situations that we're talking about here, I don't think that there's much that is romantic about this project. I mean, I don't think that it's entirely kind of a technological utopian project. And there are certain aspects of it that keep it from that arena, mostly your conceptual model, which, you know, is has this kind of delightful grotesqueness about it that, you know, is yeah, you know, I mean, especially seeing this like the in section, you know, and all of those layers and everything. The question about whether or not greenery seduces us away from the problems of climate change, right? Like, oh, is greenery going to solve, you know, the problems of climate change? Is a good one, and you know, and it is a fair one, and it's certainly one that, you know, I've thought about in my own work, is that, you know, whether, to what extent are we, you know, seduced by the greenery, right? You know, as an answer to what comes in front of us. And so but I think that the reason that these questions are being brought up is because if you go back to your boards, there is a tendency toward picturesqueness in the way that you've represented the thesis ideas. Now, that's not necessarily in the way that you talked about it, and it's not necessarily in the animation, but we have these views, we have paths, we have like the winding path around, you know, that's sort of below grade. There's a kind of pictorial setback to, you know, certain aspects of it, and I think that, you know, going forward with this, I know that you wanted to be kind of clean in your thinking, but going forward with this, I think that in order to maybe dispel some of that techno-utopian aspect of it, you might have to get a little bit more gluey and, you know, strange and, you know, and collagey and, you know, and all of those things that invite a visual that doesn't feel like we're solving a problem as much as it feels like, you know, this is yet another layer onto, like I said, recolonizing the planet. You know, it's not going to be pretty. Right. It's not going to just go ahead. It's like, it's not going to be pretty. Well, whatever we end up doing is not, you know, it's not going to make this wonderful Adam and Eve, right, you know, kind of Garden of Eden setting. But you know, it could be very effective at what we need to do. And so, you know, I mean, I think that there are plenty of both landscape architects and artists, you know, conceptual artists that are working in ways that, you know, can give us clues as to, you know, how, you know, really at the end, in the end, that it might not be, you know, appetizing in the pictorial sense.
I wonder if I may make a small contribution to the comments. First of all, I also wanted to make clear that the same way Dora was speaking about this idea of future, how we can develop in the future, what I really wanted to emphasize in terms of my comment is the model that Ashkan made. And perhaps you could zoom in just a bit again on the model, which for me conveys so much that a drawing, however animated, however detailed, cannot really relay. When we look at something like this, I think categorically, we can see a tremendous difference in terms of the physical models that students used to make just 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, where the site was clearly delineated relative to the architectural intervention. In the future, since we understand our problems are so many and our environmental relationships are so tenuous, it would seem to me like this model really speaks about how we have to think about how we develop projects, how we conceive of projects, how we realize projects in the context of this very complex future environment where we cannot take the ground for granted. We cannot take the air for granted. We cannot even take vegetation for granted. Consequently, we have to really consider a site in its manifold aspects, cutting deep into the ground. And that's what I find very compelling. And in this sense, your model is very complementary to your idea. And I would say much more even than your drawings, because here, seeing the section, seeing the difference between either designed decay or intentional decay or eventual decay. These three different kinds of decay seem to speak for us as designers, a way to really understand how tenuous it is, our relationship to what we design, what we can conceive, and what we can project for the future. So thank you, Ashkan, for this model. And of course, for the rest of your presentation. Would there be any other final comments from the other critics, or perhaps from Catherine?
Sure. I would love to make a final comment. This is really, I really appreciate the comments that you all made here. I think you quite got it very quickly, and there's a level of discourse that Ashkan has been pretty fearless about engaging with. And even I would say watching, I lived in Greenpoint for 8 years, and I just did a quick Google on the cancer rates. I didn't drink the water when I was there because I was fully paranoid, but I did have a fairly elaborate garden that took way too long to get going for obvious reasons. So, you know, this problem is so real, and that gentrification happened so quickly. I watched buildings go up on sites that I had done the DEC research on that were utterly unsafe, and it's going to be going on for some time. So this type of approach here, it's been really fantastic to be a part of shepherding it. And I will say too, the model was this kind of enigmatic superstar of our in-person review this past week, and this kind of intuitive process of putting it together really informed the thinking. And Michael, thank you for that final comment on that, because the material practice here became really, really essential to the theoretical underpinnings, and that's what we always hope for. So thanks everybody, and thank you, Ashkan.
Yeah, thank you for all the comments. It was incredibly rich and great. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashkan. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you again to our guest critics. So with that, and it seems like we're just about on time, let's transition to the second project, which would be presentation by Katie Kwok. Katie, would you like to start the screen share? And I'll give a very brief introduction for Katie's work as you look at this animated GIF introducing her work. Katie will actually introduce the intent, the motivations, the foundation of our studio. But I'd just like to note our studio was conceived, our site was chosen, our clients were designated exactly in response to a series of workshops that the Harvard GSD conducted that was sponsored by ACOM over the course of 6 semesters, for which the students and the faculty were sponsored on an in-person trip lasting 2 to 3 weeks, and for which they concluded with a physical full-scale mock-ups and exhibition. Now, consequent to these 6 series of workshops, the residents, the local architecture community, and also the academic community really have been criticizing the results of that series of workshops. In response, for us in our studio, we specifically wanted to consider what we can do, how we can contribute to a real problem at a real site with extremely difficult conditions, with extremely difficult, let's say, aspects or parameters of an architecture project that normally our students are not able to engage in. And most importantly, we also wanted to take advantage of the ability to connect with our colleagues, with experts, with even the local residents at such a faraway community, which has been made possible by the pandemic. So if there's any silver lining to the pandemic, it is perhaps exactly the fact that we have so many guest jurors today at this moment connected to us from far away, but also over the course of this whole semester, we had extensive consultation in real time with groups of people, also fellow students working on similar sites and similar problems in the Philippines. So thank you. And Katie, please go ahead.
Hi, so I'll be introducing the studio motivations. First, our studio aims to underscore the generative productive aspects of remote learning and working by producing design proposals for a modest but well-documented community almost exactly on the other side of the world, Baseco compound in Manila Bay, the Philippines. The community consists principally of the urban poor who were displaced rapidly and wholesale by renewal projects throughout Metro Manila that found refuge on a singularly isolated, widely exposed artificial island never intended for urbanization. Consequently, its architecture has remained mostly informal and its infrastructure minimal, despite some 40 years of inhabitation and the rise of its density to an incredible 460 persons per acre. Such density corresponds to 12,000 persons occupying the 25 acres of the Pratt Brooklyn campus. These images show the living conditions in Baseco. The site is infamously inundated by refuse and victimized by organ merchants while vulnerable to rising waters, extreme weather, and continuing contamination. Worse, the community is now at risk of further marginalization or even displacement as Metro Manila begins approving proposals for expanding into the water through massive multi-billion-dollar, strictly high-end developments such as the adjacent City of Pearl and Horizon Manila, which are just a couple reclamation projects of the many in Manila Bay. More pointedly, the plight of the Baseco compound is emblematic of the millions of people living in informal communities worldwide, especially as informal communities commonly occupy the margins of our built world, where they are the least represented, the most exposed, and therefore the most urgently in need of truly innovative, effective design strategies and proposals. Its distress is representative of real world, not first world problems. In so doing, the studio aspires for our students' complete reassessment of their design values, priorities, and methodologies. These satellite images show the progress of Baseco's land reclamation over the years, but only the land shown in the 2001 image is actually stable land. The compound is at risk of storm surges, flooding, and tsunamis. Our studio will invoke, deploy, and thereby evaluate design strategies for explicitly superposing architecture and infrastructure at multiple spatial, temporal, and human scales, so as to address the immediacy of the discrete and specific distinctly from the protraction of the distributed and general. Design proposals will be conceived and developed to operate incrementally or simultaneously at spatial scales ranging from single-family homes to high-density housing, temporal scales ranging from urban to generational, and human scales spanning street children to extended families to neighborhoods. Our design studio will undertake the conception and development of a formwork for the Baseco compound, which may be construed as a composite of programmatic scaffolding for the present and metaphoric framing for the future. Students will be tasked with studying and designing one of the following composites: livable infrastructures, resilient voids and buffers, self-help architecture, and programmable, scalable circulation. Now I will be presenting my projects. The network aims to resolve Baseco Beach's pollution problem by building an inhabitable, operable water cleaning neighborhood on the waters of Manila Bay. The components of the network are aggregable and flexible as they create a system that allows for it to be reorganized, reconnected, and grown over time, adjusting to Baseco's present-day needs as well as its needs 50 years in the future. As a self-help architecture proposal, this intervention involves the participation of Baseco residents by living and working on the network. My area of focus will be the Baseco Beach and Manila Bay. One of their biggest problems is the pollution problem. Each year, residents make a collaborative effort to clean up the beach, but their efforts are just a band-aid solution and cannot stop the continuous flow of trash down the Pasig River into the bay that then will inevitably wash ashore. Baseco also has to deal with flooding, which can displace thousands of people from their homes and make traveling on land difficult. Because of all the waste that contaminates the water, simply removing the solid trash is not enough to purify the seawater, and the water itself needs to be treated. The quality of the water can be harmful to the health of residents and emits foul odors. When designing the network, I first took inspiration from what already existed in the Philippines. In this image of a traditional Filipino fishing village, they used bamboo stilts to make elevated circulation, built houses out on the water, and cast nets out on the water for long periods of time. From the next two presidents, I borrowed their structural systems and flotation devices. The site analysis shows the current lack of access to the waterfront. On the north side, there is the only main road that is wide enough to allow for vehicles to pass through, while on the south side, there are a few very narrow roads due to the density. Also, the division at the beach at its center became a natural starting point for my project to extend out of. These collages showcase some ideas that were most important to me when I first began the project. I wanted to establish a hierarchy of pathways, a programmed boardwalk, residences on the water, and facilities and spaces that Paseco residents do not have access to on land. The specific plan that I'm presenting today is to address what Paseco needs in the next couple years. It is composed of 3 branches extending from the boardwalk, which are programmed by a fishing community area, trade school, wastewater treatment systems, and residential buildings. The first 2 branches are a 5-minute walk away from the beach, and to the end of the present day boardwalk would take 12 minutes. First, the boardwalk. 6 apartment complexes will be built to accommodate for 60 families who will live and work on the network. Space frames are used as easy to assemble modules for the apartments and playgrounds. These space frames also provide structure beneath these buildings and playgrounds. The residential buildings consider Paseco's tropical climate through metal mesh facades, balconies for shade and air, and porosity for cooling. Also, these space frames can be easily deployed as shelter to address the immediacy for living spaces while the residence is gradually being built. Here's branch 1. Branch 1 consists of wastewater treatment systems, which are placed furthest out from shore and will deal with the garbage further out before it reaches the beach. Workers will operate the machinery that disinfects the ocean water. Space frames are used here again to house equipment and machinery. Here's branch 2. In branch 2, a trade school for learning how to operate wastewater treatment systems will be implemented. This provides residents with education and employment. These prefab buildings serve as classrooms and rest areas. Lastly, here's branch 3. In branch 3, an area will be designated for the return of the fishing community once the waters are revitalized. An open air market will also be added to allow residents to buy and sell fish. Here, the same prefab structures can be used. Next, I want to go over the components of these branches. The network is fundamentally made up of all the same parts, but each element serves multiple purposes. These components also take on the roles of different types of formwork: self-help architecture, resilient voids and buffers, livable infrastructures, and programmable scalable circulation. Barges are used as livable infrastructure as they are large open spaces that can accommodate a wide variety of programs. Multiple barges can be parked next to each other and can allow for many different elements to be connected with it. Rather than building wide open spaces that would require extensive structure, barges can connect to any part of the boardwalk and fulfill that space necessity. These apartments can be assembled by the residents. The garbage filtration systems are organized by gradients of nets. There is a wider mesh net at the front to collect larger pieces of garbage, while the thinner mesh at the back catches smaller pieces of garbage. Workers can load the collected trash onto a barge, which then can be sent to a processing facility. Piers extend out from the walkways for fishing and boat parking. Water tanks can be used for wastewater treatment or even be repurposed as swimming pools. This diagram shows the structural arrangement of the project. Yellow elements are more permanent, requiring piles into the seabed, while green elements can be secured by bamboo stilts. These pinpoints allow for the white elements to float in between. Lastly, the network is a system that is meant to change over time to adapt to Paseco's needs. You'll see that the components multiply and programs change, but it ultimately still uses the same construction materials and resources. This plan shows what I think the network could evolve into 50 years from now. If the erosion of Paseco's land continues, the residents will be able to relocate onto the water rather than having to leave the area completely. To conclude, the network aims to resolve Paseco Beach's present-day pollution problem by building a water-cleaning neighborhood, but in its bigger picture, it aims to help Paseco against its vulnerabilities from its environmental battles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. Did you want to jump over to the mural, which may make it easier for us to see all the slides and movies at the same time?
Hi, I have a question can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, I took off my microphone for a second. I just want to make sure. I have a question just to ask. Katie, first of all, the ambition behind this project is great. And I like to see women master planning. So that's my own bias. But let me ask you about material resources. Where are all these materials coming from? What's the relationship to port, and the way in which the material flow could happen? Eventually, like you said, that these could all end up being on water, and so and I'm not getting that from the site because you're only really giving us the beach head, and so I'm wondering about material flow and where the material comes from.
Yeah, so I didn't really show the full site context, but in the area, there's a lot of shipping kind of piers where they use a lot of barges. And Paseco used to be one of those kind of shipping areas. And as well as I was looking back to traditional Filipino construction for the fishing villages, and a lot of what they build is on bamboo stilts. So I thought I could re-implement those building techniques into this project. But also as well as introducing more stronger materials, maybe that will have to be brought in from elsewhere to create like a more solid boardwalk, or to make these space frames.
I have a question that I hope is a fair question. In Michael's introduction, he hinted at the fact that the genesis of the studio is sort of rooted in these studios that were done at the GSD that had a certain received a certain amount of criticism, which hints at the idea that the studio project might be understood as a kind of critique of another body of work. And I guess I'm curious if this project has an embedded critique of that other studio work with which I'm totally not familiar. So it's sort of part of the question in it. And if so, what that is. In other words, like, is there a read that, and I don't need to know too much about somebody else's work, but I'm kind of much more curious in how you, like, it seems part of the studio that the work is positioned as a kind of critique against another body of work, or a certain approach to this site. And I'm curious, beyond the kind of benefits, which is sort of how you're presenting it, how you understand it as a critical project.
So there wasn't like a certain project that from the Harvard GSD that I was trying to critique, but it was just like the studio was overall taking a different kind of approach when thinking about how to build for Paseco, because for the Harvard GSD, I believe that the approach they took didn't address the site or how different that Paseco is compared to like building in America.
So how do you position your approach against that approach, I guess, which is actually a perfect sort of level that I am kind of interested in, right? Like I understand, I think I understand something of your approach, but I guess what I'm kind of curious about is where that came from.
I think, well, first my project started out as just wanting a way to deal with the pollution problem of Paseco. And then when trying to figure out how this could be built without turning it into one of those giant superstructures that we showed, those land reclamation projects, just trying to find a different way to create a large scale project without introducing these massive platforms of concrete.
Perhaps I can also add to Katie's comment. I suppose the principal aspect of preceding projects, all preceding projects, not just the GSD project, is how they treated the actual site of Paseco. As Katie mentioned and showed, in 2001, Paseco actually constituted only 20% of the land we see now. The rest was literally built up with refuse, literally landfill, literally garbage. So surprisingly, even very recently constructed government housing projects on site actually treat the land as a given, and in a way that seems to suggest a lack of understanding of how tenuous that land is. So for Katie's project, I think, and in this case, she's the only student in the studio who pursued this specific future for Paseco, the idea that actually the site is not land, but the site is water. And that's, I think, a critical aspect that hopefully will contribute into the general discourse for a place like Paseco, because the alternatives that the governments are proposing, local governments, federal governments in the Philippines, is wholesale removal of the residents from this area so that they can then proceed with their highly closed, highly exclusionary land reclamation projects.
I mean, that's really interesting because it sounds like on one level, right, there's a question of terrain, right, and or territory, maybe it's a better word, you know, and so the idea that, you know, on one hand, the project is shifting from land to water, which is in a sense a kind of, you know, removal of the populace. It's just not as far, maybe. And so a question that arises is like, is it better to, you know, completely shift from being land-based to being water-based if that water is sort of close to the land? Or would it be better to remain on land if that land is at some substantial distance from, you know, from the original place? And I think to make that argument, and I think the project hints at this, there needs to be a kind of understanding of how people live both on land and on water, which I think there is. Like, I think it's starting to get there with like the fishing village, for example. But I don't know, it took a lot of unpacking to get there, but it's a really interesting question, right? Like, you know, is it a, like what would make the people, this is maybe a sort of a more proper question, like what would make the people who inhabit this new, I'm not going to call it a mega structure, this new thing, like what would make them feel like they have not been displaced, you know? Or maybe another question is, have they been displaced, but it's just a question of degree? Like that's what, I guess that's what I'm trying to unpack. Like, I'm not so interested in the project. It's like a solution to any kind of environmental anything, but I think the idea that it has a very particular attitude to the idea of displacement is really fascinating.
I think that's really actually a key question is, I mean, because as sea levels rise, one thing that we don't talk about in relationship to climate change is what's going to be a massive refugee crisis. And, and just, I mean, beyond crisis, massive human global migration that's going to occur. And so I like the idea of world making in place or land making in place, right? That in a sense, you just kind of generate your next territory. And so this is why I asked the material question. Actually, is it was kind of this question, which is it seems to me that this would be an opportunity maybe to think about ways in which we can convert, trash and wash ashore and, sand and, all of that stuff, into the stuff that we're going to need to make new land. And even if it's incredibly speculative and, and fantastical, I think it would be nice to kind of close the loop a little bit here, or tell me, or indicate what is the global loop that now this region belongs to, right? I mean, is there kind of a global system that now this is a zone of, or is it its own kind of closed loop of from this type of land to this type of land? And similarly, I would ask the question about what's going on under the water. I mean, are these pilings going, how deep are they? I mean, are we talking caissons here? What are we talking about in terms of the construction of this, this new land? And know that construction is itself dangerous, and puts out a lot of its own kind of pollutants, and maybe thinking about ways to mitigate both that danger and that and that offset, and maybe taking advantage of it too, right? Of ways that we can construct this inevitable future. And I would love for the people of this area to become, not only to gain their territory through making that territory, but to become self-sufficient through that territory, so that there's water filtration systems, there's ways in which to convert salt water into fresh water, there's desalination plants, there's sewage treatment, there's all of those things that are taken account of here, more than say housing and parks and that kind of infrastructure. But I really, like I said, I like the idea of of trying to take this on as a reterritorialization project, and I think that what you're doing here is intriguing, and it's an incredible proposition for what we're probably all going to have to do into this near future.
I think there's a lot of irony in this project. I like the notion of not resisting nature. I like the notion that it's inevitable, that the waters are rising and land is getting washed away and becoming part of the sea. And why not embrace it? And how do we instead of resisting it, how do we find new ways of inhabiting that space? Having said that, then moving out to the sea seems almost contradictory. Why not allow the land itself to become the sea, and then implement measures of how to inhabit that same land without having to displace the population, because in a way that's the acknowledgement, is that these sites are getting flooded increasingly and people are getting displaced. So it seems almost, I would say, a bit formalistic to sort of then implement this very almost metabolist kind of architecture, because in fact, metabolism kind of started out in, I guess, around 1928 in Switzerland. It was a way, it was part of the agenda of the international style of actually creating a systematic approach of unifying architecture in cities, not in an indigenous way, but in a kind of an international style. And so there's a kind of an aesthetic here that seems to deny some of the observations of the sort of more grassroots, local indigenous kind of forms of architecture and materiality. And there's a kind of a machinic, almost maritime or a platform, like refinery platform aesthetic that's being deployed. So I guess my question is that intentional? And how does this architecture, how is it informed by, I don't want to sound touchy-feely, by its genius loci, outside of the fact that there is industry, that maritime industry is in the region? How does this respond, just in terms of like the creation of its own environment that is a mix of technology and a mix of its kind of location and culture?
To try to answer that question, I'd say like my project is kind of the formal version of what is already existing. It's a lot more, technological, but I think what Prosecco currently has isn't enough. Like they don't have everything that they need. So I think it would make sense to give them more. I don't really have a good way to phrase it, but it's like,
yeah, no, I think I understand what you were trying to do. In terms of the sort of the network that seems almost organically grown, but it is highly structured and geometric. I understand that, but when you're talking about like space frames, and then on the bottom left, you're looking at those sort of house structures, they almost look like brownstone structures in Brooklyn, right? Just to be more deliberate about what is the language that you're deploying, and how is that language informed, not simply saying the space frame is a kind of a formal or formalization of the bamboo, because there's so much legacy and the space frame and that kind of aesthetic and these sort of containers, and even choice of material. I mean, we know that in terms of like seawater and structures that are very prone to decay and corrosion because of the salt and also the pollution, just being more deliberate about these choices. I think it's sort of, in terms of the big picture, it's a brilliant kind of development. You're very skillful and you have great formal ability. It's just being more conscientious about what otherwise comes across as almost a kind of casual selection of language and materials, to be more intentional about why you've chosen certain aesthetics and certain materials.
Yeah, I think maybe this kind of piggyback on some of the earlier comments. And like my kind of general observation is that the kind of the use of platforms, like linear or branching platforms, as well as the kind of the geometry of your project, it seems to suggest a kind of sense of nostalgia to the way that we used to live on the land. And I don't know if that's kind of a deliberate intent of saying, to reconcile the question of displacement, to say that, okay, so we are forced to relocate to other part of the territory, but then we still want to somehow relate to our kind of the way we live on the land in the past. So this is kind of like some sort of like a mitigating in between strategy or something else. I'm not sure. So I think that's something that maybe you want to take a position on and be clear about, to say like, is this kind of, like maybe there's that kind of like, like a lifestyle or kind of cultural significance of living in this particular way in terms of like geometries and platforms and so on and so forth. Or you maybe want to totally challenge that, right? Because I'm thinking about kind of people doing work in like legal studies and how land, how we relate to the land is kind of it create a kind of new kinds of like sovereignty in particular cases. So for example, that, if you think about the territorial strategy on land, it's always about subdivision, like geometric subdivision of the land into pieces. I guess the US is the United States state line is a kind of a good example of that. But I think here that you actually have something that's actually much more oceanic, right? Like it's not necessarily about subdivision, but rather you have this kind of system where that doesn't really have inside and outside. So with that in mind, I'm curious, like, have you ever kind of considered things like, the current or like the tidal waves or the riptide of these territories and how these kinds of vectors inform the decision makings for kind of your planning processes, whether that's locating the kind of housing or like thinking about water treatment and the kind of the daily routines or the rituals of these inhabitants for your project.
Sorry, that's a super fascinating critique, and what it makes me think about is the way she's tied in the idea of fishing, because I'm like your idea of understanding like territory as it relates to legal frameworks. I'm now venturing into territory about which I know very little, but fishing is something where sort of rights are usually assigned. But when I think about how territory has happened, let's say in the United States, like there's an idea that like, let's say if you plant on it, you can claim it. So like, to me, when I think about the sort of implications of the sort of lens that you're suggesting for viewing the project, I think about the idea that, let's say she might shift from an idea of like a fishing village to some sort of like, I don't know, like seaweed harvesting village, where you would go from an idea of like extraction to an idea of agriculture as a way of like claiming that territory, and then explore the architectural implications of that, which I think the system she's set up could totally handle. And I think that's a really, really fascinating way of like reframing the project in terms of these questions of territory. That I'm sure there are sort of like myriad other ways in which that would sort of branch out, but I think once you open up the possibility that it's not about recapitulating the way one lives on land, but about positing a new way in which one moves to the sea, not just in terms of daily life, but also in terms of like, legal frameworks. I think it really opens up a lot of possibilities. I think the other place where I think that could help is in the kind of somewhat tenuous relationship between what is sort of heavy infrastructure and what is infrastructure that is, I'm not going to use the word self-help because I have a lot of problems with that. But I would say participatory might be a better way of reframing those construction techniques as they would relate to the idea of reclaiming territory.
That's a very particular point that we had to address in the studio, Henry, and also Ziri. As you can see from this image that Katie is showing from her presentation, this is the typical fishing village out in Manila Bay, in this case at low tide. So there's always a conflict because what happens is the governments, their coastal patrol come in and remove them because they're trying to prevent bottom-up small-scale fishermen from harvesting, from setting up these structures, and in some cases actually obstructing the waterway. And so it's a cat and mouse game that the fishing community, supported by the peninsula of Paseco, plays with the authorities, where they pop up here, they pop up there, they harvest, they collect, and then they pull everything away until that they can restart somewhere else. Since Manila Bay is so expansive, sometimes it takes a long time for the government actually to reach whatever outcropping, whatever location they have, let's say, colonized. What's really, as well, I think, particularly relevant to what Ziri and Henry responded to for Paseco is that Paseco was first inhabited by the fishermen because of the specific use of the Filipino fishing boats, which made it very easy to dock directly on the beach. It's the only beach in all Manila Bay. And so it became the only access by the waterbound community to connect with the land side. And that was something I think Katie in particular was really fascinated by because she looked at this image over and over, trying to literally harvest their techniques and their ideas, their deployment, getting a sense of that sort of lightness, that sort of flexibility and adaptability, and perhaps most importantly, that resilience. With respect to Henry, what you were saying before, in this case, Paseco is characterized by residents who actually, as we imagine in informal housing communities, build their own houses and maintain them. So after every typhoon, they go back in and reinforce, tie in the knots, drive in a few more piles, put in more hay or more straw or whatever refuse or repurposed materials they can to reconstitute their village after every disaster. So remarkably, that's something I think for my students, it was something really interesting to learn is how, let's say, handy the actual residents were relative to their own housing. The only thing they cannot really avoid is the flood. They can't really consistently elevate large populations of Paseco compound up above the water, which by now has become, sadly, a weekly occurrence.
I mean, I guess what I was reacting to is like, if you're, let's say, positing certain kinds of construction technologies that can be engaged in by the inhabitants, there are many ways of framing that. And I think when you frame it as self-help, it puts it into a kind of like neoliberal framework of being on your own and responsible for yourself because no one's going to help you. But I think if you recast it more specifically in terms of territory and legal frameworks, which I've now become very, very fascinated in since that comment, I think you can understand it as a way of like claiming territory, creating ownership, and potentially even, let's say, creating a claim on this new waterbound territory. And that's why I have a problem with that, with that term of self-help. because I think it sort of completely, abrogates, the responsibility of, governments to take care of their people. That may be the reality, but I think the possibility that that, let's say, infrastructures could be set up to allow people to sort of claim a certain type of ownership is a much more kind of liberating, idea of a project that I think is actually what's here. But I think creating that, I mean, Doris kind of touched on this, like, I would really want to understand the line between, what is heavy infrastructure that is not participatory in this way, and what are the construction techniques that allow people to sort of inhabit that structure, and what's that interface? Because I think the interface is really critical.
That I think that's like ultimately, I mean, there's a big question here. And Katie, I'm sorry, I'm going a little off script of your thesis, which has to do with, as climate change forces us to re-territorialize, we don't have to play capitalism the way we've been playing it. We don't have to play. There's no hard fast rule that we're going to have to keep playing capitalism the way that we've been playing it. And if that's the case, right, then when we look at these sort of master plan projects, we could begin to think of them maybe in some ways like the like the early modernists did, with a heavy dose of ideology that, that could be or could not be there, right, or emphatically not there, right, that we come to a crossroads, in other words. And it's more than just like, oh, we're going to make this village and it's going to be, kind of critical regionalism, that that will save these people's, lives and livelihood, and really, kind of force the hand of entrenched systemic inequalities that, that exist. I mean, the yucky beach is not just a yucky beach. I mean, it is the product of global flow, right? It is the product of systemic inequality that, is literally washing up on that shore. And so, all the Coke bottles and plastic wrappers and all of that kind of stuff, and so, I think that in 2071, I should hope that that we're willing as people in architecture, just, maybe a little bit like the early 20th century, European males, that we would be willing to think in terms of those, in terms of the scope, and not just what's at stake, but the real kind of revolutions that we can make, given that the territory ain't the territory anymore, and so this could collectively belong to these people. It could, they could decide that they're kind of an island and that they don't need any other, trade or, importation. They could be entirely self-sufficient, or they could decide that, they're going to belong to this network or that network or that network, right? I mean, there's all kinds of really great scenarios, but I think in the end, we have to, as architects, be starting to ask ourselves those, not be afraid to start to ask ourselves those big questions about, where's our thinking headed, and, are we going to keep, repeating the tropes of capitalism over and over and over again? That's my rant for the day. Sorry, Katie, I went off script on your thesis.
No, I think that's a good observation. I mean, whether it's deliberate or if it's been said explicitly or not, there is an inherent ideology with this approach. There's a lot of assumptions that people will buy into this mechanism and that somehow it will be subsidized and sponsored. And I think I want to make sure, Katie, you understand that I value your work and your skill tremendously. So this isn't about taking anything away from your accomplishments. It's more about what, the politics around such an ideological approach should not be overlooked because it's also not a new politic. It's something that has existed for a very long time. The one thing that, ironically, the authorities might actually welcome such a structure because then they can actually pinpoint it. And if they were, if one of the games that's at play right now is the fact that these people are actually quite elusive and they can move at any one point, or they have a kind of a temporal existence. But then when you're looking at such a structure that actually is anchored and identifiable, then it also becomes a mechanism of control that they can contain this population, right? There's a really strange thing that I came across while living in Switzerland, of all places. And what they do is that instead of like more hardline kind of governments that try to limit or control, let's say, substance abusers and criminalize them. In Zurich, of all places, that's considered such a pristine and kind of a almost clinical culture, and so organized. They actually have a place called Needle Park. And what that does is that it allows authorities to actually keep track and identify all the substance abusers, all the addicts. And what they do is they in fact have clinics that will give them heroin or whatever substances they're addicted to. It becomes a way of control, it becomes a way of oversight. So this kind of very formal demarcation and kind of occupation may fire back politically. And it may actually become a play into the hands of the authorities rather than the more kind of elusive, almost pop-up occupations. The pop-up occupations kind of also have a history, and in post Cold War Germany, for example, in Berlin, they used to have, and mostly in the east of Berlin, after the wall came down, they used to have these pop-up bars and clubs, and the authorities couldn't actually keep track of them because they would be announced the same day. Like they would go and occupy an abandoned building or apartment house, and then suddenly it became this incredibly festive and celebratory place, and nobody could keep track of them. They were extremely elusive, if you will. So it's, how do you balance the kind of the elusive qualities of this culture with the kind of the willfulness of actually trying to formalize it and create a very kind of demarcated space?
That's a fantastic image. And I wish we would have some of that here in New York City, despite the reputations we have. Thank you, Yama. Here, if you see on this slide, and perhaps in response to what you were just talking about, it's really quite fascinating, I think, for us also as a studio to understand that these projects, these mega projects, multi-billion-dollar projects, massive towers with amazing parks, its own light rail system, its own water supply, its own resources, its own power generation, and those fanciful marinas that you see are conceived to be located directly adjacent to Baseco without doing anything for Baseco. And so perhaps that's a way we can really understand the real context on the scale of architecture, on the scale of planning, and on the scale of, let's say, how little 60,000 people in this community get represented in this otherwise massive megapolis of 16 to 17 million people, and how this is their image right now. As you note, recently approved project here, Horizon Manila, they've started laying out these artificial islands. What happens if we are faced with this kind of proposal, which essentially discards the rest of the city in favor of this isolated, controlled utopia? Perhaps now is a good time to see if anyone has any final comments for Katie. If not, then perhaps it's a good time to transition directly to our next project. Thank you, Dora. Thank you, Cerise. Thank you, Yama. And thank you, Henry, for your comments.
Yes. Great project, Katie.
So Mark and Zikong, both of you are co-hosts.
Yeah, very good. Zikong, you can put on your initial slide and then I'll talk. We're going to go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum in terms of the scale, the temporal scale and the temporal and the spatial scale of the two other projects that we've seen today. This is the scale of this intervention is in one building in the Hutong in Beijing. The studio, let me tell you a little bit about the studio and then I'll let Zikong tell you about her project. The studio was entitled Reforming the Social Space of Our Institutions. And the students were allowed to pick any institution anywhere that they wanted to engage with. And so we had everything from refugee centers for Angolan refugees in Portland, Maine, a museum of the culture of cars in car culture in Las Vegas, a hybrid library freelance workspace in Austin, Texas, the extension of the botany department at the university in Lagos, combining with the local market to explore herbs and plants for medicine and cuisine, a hybrid food pantry student center at Pratt, a biomuseum in Brighton Beach, a nature center in New Jersey in the Meadowlands, focusing on invasive species and native species, and a cross-cultural textile museum, the cultures of India and Tibet in Ahmedabad, and a physical rehabilitation center in Brooklyn, looking at the rehabilitation of physical structure and human structure. But here we have Zikong's engagement as she is in Beijing, engaging and went into the Hutong and noticed the elderly population having no place really on the street and in the buildings. And so she sought to engage with that in order to give them a various sense of engagement with the engagement of new architecture with the traditional architecture. And with that, I'll let Zikong take it away.
Hi, I'm Zikong, and starting with the stat information, as my professor mentioned about, I chose a courtyard, especially called Ringo housing in China and in Beijing. And well, that's a kind of typical housing typology in China, and it lasts for thousands of years. the one that I choose is in a protected area in Beijing, and at that area, there is a kind of limitation of the height that people are not allowed to build the second floor, because we are keeping the coherence of the texture of the building, as well as having a protection and keeping that area as a union in Beijing. And those are the two images that for the current situation that the institute I chose. And when I went there, as my professor mentioned, there is a lack of the fresh food supply in that hutong, and as well as I noticed that there is no seats and no benches on the street side. People are sitting on the floor, sitting on the ground, and also at the same time, I noticed that this is a period that most elderly people live. And what they do is they usually standing on the street sides or getting in a group chat on the street. But also there are kind of lonely people that sitting on the wheelchair by herself, which makes me think about the demography of this project, that I would like to choose the old grandparents as the most aimed users. And from the left side, it's the design process or the logic that I got for this project. The bottom isometric one is the original building that following a typical layout of the courtyard and the quadrangle building. And starting with bringing those isolated pieces or spaces out, I broke the windows to get the rooms more involved to the courtyard size, and then I focus on the 4 main points, that starting with the each entrance, as well as the most large spaces, that also the middle parts of this typical layouts, and then having a reforming and recombining of the overall by a kind of inflection structures, and reorganizing all the spaces with the courtyard as well as the room spaces. And from the right side is the exploded axon that I did to see what each structure does and what's the overall structural elements that this building has. Since I'm trying to merge the whole zones together instead of isolate them anymore. I divided the whole program into 3. That the front courtyard now become as a large entrance that welcome to the 3 sides, and people could having a view or directly when they're from street sides, the hutong wide, and the central courtyard, which is the secondary courtyard of this building, now becomes the food exchange market that people could selling fresh supplies. And at the same time, there is a kind of local culture that grandparents always grow vegetables or the fruits by themselves, and they could exchange it here. And this spaces provides the opportunity for them to get more involved in the communal spaces. And for the bike courtyard, it could be the kitchen cooked for or feed for this area, since they got the food supply from this one. At the same time, I pretend to have the room, the tea room or the platform here, and the structure for now are temporary. Since I would like to play more with it, with the parallel structures later in a way. One of the reasons that I have it like this, because we are now legal to build the second floor, as I mentioned before, and it must be open to the air in a way. And for this one, this is a plan that originally shown, and this is the drawing that I aim to show the difference and the comparison between the previous and now, to see how I got the each parts got involved of it and how it's gonna be merged together. With larger scale that I'm showing it, I differentiate the functions as well as the patterns that this building would got, at the same time the textures of it. So from the section 1, I'm trying to show a kind of a connection between the previous structures as well as the new one that the new pieces doing. Since the existing ones are this kind of linear adapters or those process that it has, it could be connected to the new one in a way. At the same time, this inflections should be applied on it. But I know that there's still gaps between the two, and that's the one that I would keep working on it. For this one, this is the section that I would like to show what's the continuity from the 3 sides to the inner side, from the really explicit public to the implicit private. And for the perspective sections, this is more aiming to show the materialities, at the same time how the things being aggregated together. And this is the one that I'm aiming to provide, the spaces that I'm aiming to provide, that people got the seats to talk, to play the chess, and to sit on, to have a relaxed time on it, and being welcome to this kind of center building. And this is the one that's showing was the structures have been differentiated from one to another, since the inflection could be seats, could be shelves, could be a lot of functions than it before. This is a marketplace that I provide for them, and having those inflections being designed to shelves, they could actively connected to the previous existing structures. And this is the one that for the cooking area and the eating area. For the eating area, I prefer to have more seats instead of having more tables, since the main gathering spaces would be this one. And now the people with the wheelchair got a place to see, got a place to talk. This is a courtyard I specifically use for the grandparents to dance here, since in China there's also kind of dancing culture that grandparents would like to do, and some rafters would be extruded to hold the speakers or the lights in the at night, and also the inflection would become benches or seats for others are sitting on by sides. And the last one is the renderings without people or figures on it, just showing the pure architecture of it and what it looks like, or what's the sense of this building will provide for us. And that's it. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me, Zika?
Yeah.
Hi. It's beautiful, lovely project, and for all the right reasons. Do you have any details of the joinery between the traditional Hutong rafter and the fluid one?
I do not for now, because
did you make any
you
construction?
mean the connections?
Yeah, did you make any?
Right.
Right.
for now, it got attached on the girder and the beam in a way to make it supported. But that's one of the solutions that I provide for now. And it could definitely connect it to the other parts and see in this way.
It's a little
see
dark,
in
this
way.
one.
Okay, and see in this way, in the section.
I'm going to go to the mirror. I'm going to go to the Miro and take a look then. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
But that's also the thing that I would like to work on later, since the structure for now are still gaps between the two. But I'm trying to follow with the original grid or the geometry of it in a way.
And what kind of wood?
It's bamboo.
It's bamboo. Okay, thanks.
Great.
I have a sort of a question in a similar vein, and I think what's really clear from the presentation, what's clear from the drawings, without you saying anything, is the very sensitive way in which, like, formally and materially, you insert a new kind of architecture into an existing traditional architecture or existing architecture. What's clear to me from the presentation is the way in which the new parts of the proposal relate to the way in which sort of people are inhabiting the site now, particularly as they age in a kind of existing urban condition, existing architecture. You know, one of the things that strikes me in the section that sort of enables the project is how tall they are. And I guess what I'm curious about, and this is out of my own complete ignorance, so you have to kind of take it with that grain of salt, is I guess I'm curious, like, where the kind of form and material and construction techniques of the original buildings come from. In other words, like, what, like, I think there's a kind of, you know, there's, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, it's clear the way formally the old and the new negotiate. It's clear to me but it's not clear to me, let's say, programmatically, how they negotiate. In other words, presumably that architecture is shaped by a way of living in it that may or may not be relevant anymore. Presumably it's shaped by its sort of climate, local material practices, locally available materials that also may or may not be relevant anymore. And so I'm curious how you also then say, like, understand the interface between old and new, not just formally, spatially, but also programmatically and materially.
Since this follows the original form is a kind of standard form of this kind of housing type. And at the beginning, I was trying to seek a balance between the outside hutung and the interface that the courtyard would provide. And usually we can see that from the original plan. And they are all courtyard, they are all rectangular rooms, spaces, and being divided into pieces in a way, and which makes the whole building be isolated somehow. And since it's all rectangular shape, I would like to see how a curve or how a circular shape would provide. And in China, there is a kind of also a balance between the rectangle and the circle. And that's why I would like to make this kind of courtyards being reformed in this way. And since I don't want to get rid of the philosophies that historically, but trying to bring the new or modern architecture themes or architectural philosophies into a combination way.
Zikang,
okay, but can
I just want to, Henry, let me, I think, assist in focusing Zikang on your question. Zikang, what Henry was asking about had to do with the previous or the traditional social organization of that kind of building, which you described to me in terms of hierarchy, right? There was a social hierarchy in the distribution, and which had to do with service, had to do with grandparents, had to do with children, and I think the way in which you've approached this is to break down that hierarchy in that space in order to interweave those conditions. And I don't know whether that gets Henry to the issue that you were asking about before.
That's definitely part of it. That's really interesting. I'm also asking, how tall are the existing buildings?
For the one that without roof, it's about 10 feet tall, but with the roof one, it will become 12 to 15 feet because the roof structure becomes really tall.
So like 15 feet at the ridge line of the roof, for example?
Yeah.
On the inside or the outside?
On the outside.
I mean, that's quite tall.
Right.
Why are they that tall?
Why are they that tall? Because this kind of beam and girder technique is lasted for really long, and which being protected in a way for now, and we are not this is a kind of rule that they got in the past years to having each girder or beams in a unit size.
Sorry, can you say that again? I don't think I quite got it. Are you saying that they're very tall because of the depth of the structure?
Yeah, because the structure one has a kind of rule in Chinese architecture design, and they are in unit, the size has been unified in a way. And this is the one that follows it. At the same time, this kind of housing is aimed to provide a kind of ventilation as well as the light coming in a way. And it also helps the structure hide things.
Okay. I mean, so I think one of the things that's latent in your presentation is a discussion of ventilation and also rainwater. Because I know you talked about the gardens, and so one of the things I'd sort of be curious to see, because there's so much here that's so beautiful, right? And it's clear that that's where a lot of the focus, at least in terms of the imaging of the project is. I mean, it's I'd really be interested to see sort of diagrams of airflow and rainwater, and how this sort of the new intervention interacts with the old in terms of reconfiguring interior comfort, in terms of enabling the sort of food production that you're talking about. Because I think to me, what's most interesting in the project is you're talking about enabling new ways of living, slightly new ways of living that still engage traditional ways of living inside of a kind of existing traditional structure. And so it would be really, really, or I guess the thing that I most am interested in is what very, very precisely like what you're preserving and what you're sort of changing or reconfiguring. Like that's really clear in a kind of material sense, but it's not nearly as clear in a kind of programmatic, climactic sense. And I think it's there. Which is why I'm asking for it. It's maybe programmatically more clear in the plan than it is in some of the like rendered sections and diagrams. I think actually the plan is really interesting, and I'm going to stop talking and maybe look at it on Miro.
Henry, I'm going to riff off your genius. I thought they were great comments, actually, and most of mine were those. So that was quite funny. So I've got a lot less to say. First of all, I do think it's a really great project. I do understand, as somebody who's a qualified conservation architect, the perils of any form of tampering with, if you like, heritage sites, or even working with notions of what constitutes contemporary vernacular. It seems like this massive, like the worst marriage ever in a way, doesn't it? But I think you did a really brave thing here. And I like the way in which that you, I think, tried very hard to kind of make distinct what the contemporary interventions are with this obviously historical iteration that you've produced. And although it's not drawn necessarily, and you did discuss it, but this and also imply in photographs that the low-rise nature of this particular site gives you some degree of constraint around necessarily doing anything that's more elevated perhaps. But I do think that somewhere in, if you like, advancing Dora's point about materials and what is contemporaneous, and then of course is it about in a kind of rotor kind of a way. Great architects, by the way, Belgian chaps, you should check them out. They kind of insist on deconstructing an existing building and then reconstructing a new one from the remnants of the old. So I think you can still be vernacular with the materials, but not necessarily in terms of the style and the flourishes and the aesthetics. So you could have taken a few more liberties and still been true to some extent to the kind of genius loci. I know somebody struggled with that term. I think we're all still recovering from critical regionalism of the 1990s. So yeah, but that kind of sense of working with the local materials and so on, which you're obviously keen to do. I think as well that this materials thing is one point. The other one, Henry's point about program, and what he was also alluding to about what we might fondly call end users, which sounds like a drug rehabilitation clinic. Goodness knows why we use that term. But I think this is something interesting in the renderings that you've presented of lots, older demographic. And of course, if you look actually at the statistics of that region, and in fact globally, what's happening is that we all age and obviously inconveniently don't die off, and instead live off all of our children's inheritances in perpetuity. I'm not, where I'm going with this comment is, of course, not Soylent Green or anything, by that crude film reference to annihilating elderly early, but it's to do with the fact that you have an ergonomic problem in a way, because vernacular buildings present, especially, in terms of like this, what we now consider lifetime homes, and also this increasing aging demographic, some form of physiological challenges for the elderly. And I think that could have been part of the program in terms of your materials. I do think that it's quite a challenging thing to do sometimes, to kind of wheel a wheelchair or use a Zimmer frame over wonderfully vernacular cobbles and things like that. So there's some degree of mitigation that could have been driven by, if you like, the demographic that you were targeting. And these would have been quite subtle, but just little details that often get overlooked by architects and then interior designers justify existing, because they worry about that stuff, and when really we should. But the other thing, and again, it's riffing off of Henry's remarks, is that, you have a lot of roofscape, and the average roof generates about 632 gallons of water, did you know, every year. So that's rather a lot. So I think that if, rather than say, oh, obviously just stick a load of photovoltaics on that thing, because you could generate electricity, and maybe that's a nice thing to do, of course, because you could look towards making it more autonomous. And of course, any social project, by the way, has to fund itself, because not every government gives much of a damn about funding social projects. And if there is a social project here that's about this kind of space being for this kind of particular demographic, then it's not necessarily likely to be well resourced. And just anyway, ecologically, we should be looking more towards autonomous building. But I do think that water anyway, in terms of this thing becoming a reservoir in some way, or how in a slightly Scarperian sense, and I mean Carlos Scarpa, you could have made that part of, in a way, the kind of the floor plane. It could be integrated in quite a poetic and beautiful way, but that feels like an underutilized element of this design, and not something that, of course, you can't now kind of retro engineer post exam for the purposes of getting a fabulous job when you graduate. So feel free to go for it, and of course enter into competitions next summer, given we've got 12 competitions in the school, and we'll reward both this semester's work and next. So just some things to think about. But I do think, you know, this is otherwise a really great project, very sensitive to the fact that you have set yourself remarkable constraints in a way, and then done a really great job of trying to do something that has this balance, even if it's an uneasy one. And I'm cool with being made to feel uneasy in buildings. You know, I think sometimes it's quite necessary to sort of provoke our imaginations. But, you know, you've achieved this uneasy balance between, you know, contemporary and vernacular in many ways that are successful about this project. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Anyway, thank you.
Very, very sophisticated comment. Go ahead, Tikon. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead. Sorry, Zikong, were you going to respond to Dr. Harriet's comments?
I'm sorry, I'm hardly hearing it.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought maybe you were going to respond to Dr. Harriet's comments.
I feel like she showed me a lot of directions that I could go with, especially the one that consideration of the rainwater and the program that I didn't before. And one thing that I feel struggling with before is also the program, because how it's being shaped and how this kind of inflection being applied to a program is truly hard to me. And that's the solution, because the project for now is the solution that I provide for now, and it could definitely be involved more those elements in the later design.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to maybe try to tackle it from a slightly different angle, because well, if it's about you getting a job, I think you can get a job tomorrow or today, and you have the skills and the imagery is amazing. I think I want to talk a little bit about opportunism, and how to be an opportunistic designer. Because it can start off without any level of sophistication or intellect even. And I don't mean that in a negative way. What I mean is that architecture in itself is a language that communicates. So we overlay that architecture. We have a tendency to overlay that architecture with a lot of ancillary language, and it sometimes becomes almost overburdened. And what is the architecture? Is it the intellect, or is it the form and the space that you occupy? I thought you said something very straightforward about why you chose this approach, right? You made a very geometrical kind of juxtaposition between the orthogonal nature of the historic structure and the curvilinear nature that would kind of be juxtaposed with it, almost as a kind of a dichotomy or something that kind of shakes up the historic building. And it's a different approach to historic preservation. And so while that comment or that sort of instinct or intuition may not have been such a deliberate kind of intellectual approach to this project, there are many things that gets teased out in that intuition, which is, what does it mean to preserve a historic structure? Do you have to become an expert and understand exactly how the joinery worked, and how do you preserve it, and how do you stay authentic? Or do you inject something that's completely foreign and new to it, and it actually brings the old back into life? It actually injects a new life into it. It brings it into a kind of a current existence. It's not just celebrating its past use. It actually becomes a way of making it relevant again, and making it kind of have a future instead of just a past that's celebrated. So then again, I'm drifting into a similar kind of commentary where I'm overlaying it with these suppositions, but it's about once you do something that is just purely geometric, then I think it's time to kind of step back and become also opportunistic about what you're observing formally and what's actually taking place. So all of these ideas about, does it become a kind of a water collection facility? Do you start to create these reservoirs? Do you plan for kind of water retention facilities? Do you harvest that and do you distribute that back into the community? Does it become a way of sort of gray water collection? Do you purify it for use by humans, or do you purify, or do you keep it as gray water and utilize it for vegetation and plantings and even agriculture? So these are the kinds of moments where simple formalism can tease out things that are actually much more broad in terms of the sort of how much of an effect just architectural language can have. And you being kind of very opportunistic to kind of observe that language and take it in a very direct and directed and sort of very, I would say even willful kind of approach. So instead of saying that the architectural language is just form making, that language and the product that you actually start to build and materialize starts to connect socially, culturally, and even economically.
If I may, and this is building a little bit off of the economic question that Yama brings up, as well as some of the points that Dr. Harris mentioned, is that, I mean, I actually don't know the background that well, but I suspect that the hutong has become a kind of desirable object for the semi-well-to-do of Beijing and or the well-to-do of Beijing. That it's a little bit like the Brooklyn loft. Has become both endangered and fairly, contemporized, to the point of almost ill recognition. What I call the dwellification of, so it's not just gentrification. It's, it's literally the dwellification of, turning it into something visual for Dwell magazine or D-Zine or something like that. And I'm thinking in particular about Ma Yansang's, kind of redone hutong, which is also a geometric, project, although quite a bit more audacious than this. And so the scaling back of this project, the kind of delicacy of this project, the way in which it is not overtly about, that form of gentrification, but it's about a kind of both preservation and, kind of renewed livability of the hutong is I think it's best proposition, right? I mean, I would not want this to go in the direction of the dwellification of, the contemporaneity, we can because we could. There's a sort of aesthetic, but instead the way in which it's offered, which is with all of this, original texture mapping and and the kind of semi clunkiness in which the connections are being made, they're almost somewhere between furniture and plugins, right? And not exactly. That's why I asked you about the construction detail, because if you had this really intense construction detail that basically took the existing constructional logics and extruded them and had to use, say, for example, robotic precision kinds of technologies, but instead this seems fairly low tech, it's bamboo, it's lovely, but but it's not, it doesn't appear kind of super high tech. So given that if it's, if it's about livability rather than a kind of aesthetic project of, because the first thing I would ask, if this were a dwellification thing, the first thing I'd say is, hey, if I were the older person living in the Hutong and I could, dwellify it, I just sell it to the highest bidder and go live somewhere else, And so, and being raised in rural America, this seems to be exactly what what my parents and grandparents have done, is just like, oh, you want an authentic farmhouse? Sure, buy it. Here, it's right here, and so but given that, there's this kind of low tech aspect about it, and that it is that the thesis does seem to be aimed toward a kind of adaptive livability. I think these questions of water, I think the questions of maybe not having the baskets sit on the shelves as much as maybe be integrated into that shelving, so that you no longer need to buy all of those, sort of pieces. I think paying attention not just to the elderly and their mobility, but the hyper mobility of the children, right? And slides and climbing stuff, and and everything that children would like to do. I think that ways in which those surfaces could enable greater mobility through the Hutong, handrails and so forth, and ways in which you could negotiate. I'm noticing still that the step is there in the Hutong. You might want to soften the floor of the Hutong is still a little bit, I would say, rough, and you might want to increase some of the livability at that level as well. And then it to me is a very, very intriguing proposition about the ways in which all of us could be thinking about not just preserving our historic fabric, but increasing its livability for multi-generations for years to come without having to sell it to the highest bidder. And that is very, very interesting. So thank you for this project.
And if I may jump in with a comment. Thank you, Zikon, for your presentation, and thank you, Mark. I thought, for me, what was really compelling is in this particular drawing, what we can see in brown, the poche of your surfaces, your shapes, in a way that seems to actually reverse the hierarchy, meaning that if we see this as an existing building, instead of thinking perhaps about the specifics of the existing structure, how long it may last, what material it may be made from, but perhaps what you are really suggesting for me is this idea that in terms of design, from, in certain sense, the top down, in terms of design, from the ability to manufacture these fanciful surfaces with these amazing curvatures, and in terms of the actual deployment of material, that is to say, whether or not these materials are reflected of the sun, provision of shade, whether or not they can redirect water, and indeed whether or not they can actually be themselves the program with respect to touch, to occupation, with respect to creating those surfaces that we so often want for our human bodies, but usually, as the existing building seems to suggest, we're not able to provide. The idea that perhaps the domain of architectural design is not just, in this sense, the structure behind it creating these spaces, but actually extends to this idea of almost architectural furniture that is much more directly responsive to our human bodies. And of course, by extension, if we think about the human body as an individual, then of course we can immediately think about the different kind of scales at which it can operate. For you, Zikon, in particular, thinking about families, thinking about groups of people, thinking about the children who would access those surfaces in a very different way because they could literally tuck themselves under and have a little shade separated from the adults or their grandparents playing chess nearby. This is, for me, something very evocative. And in particular, perhaps then I would suggest and advocate the idea that your project is not bounded by this actual building, this rectangular frame. in this void of white space that we see purports to be single gallery, but really ultimately it's just a digital board. But instead, if we can think about this surface actually occupying the real world, how would we build it? How indeed, once we deploy it and think about all the different ways we can build it and deploy it at scale, we can actually compensate for the deficiencies either of older structures or even the newer structures. And most importantly, perhaps we can really compensate for the deficiencies of, let's say, the lack of imagination in some of the larger mega projects being proposed, especially in China, especially for those massive metropolises where everything is a hard surface, where everything is an artificial green, and everything is, unfortunately, far, far detached from the human scale, the human body, and of course, the human mind.
And I'll add, Michael, that I think that's why there's so much tactility in this project, right? Is exactly that there's a nearness, what Tom Main would call nearness, in this project that is definitely bringing that sense, that sensitivity, that it's a sort of furniture, but also insisting that architectural furniture is part of the architecture now. It's part of all of the considerations that we make as architects.
I'm going back to the comments about the dualification, and I'm now sort of looking harder, or let's say more critically. And I guess the question, and in some ways this simply recapitulates my earlier comments, but if you were to change out the entourage to kind of like well-dressed young-ish people, and you were to change out the things on those curvy shelves to be like, I don't know, like high-end tableware, right? Like, would that entourage be out of place? Or like, would that representation be out of place in the project as it stands now? And I don't think it would be, and I don't think that's the ambition of the project. I mean, I think, and so in some ways, like, I think the sort of beauty of the graphics, this is the worst comment ever, by the way. Like, you're gonna hate this comment. I'm telling you that now. In some ways, like, the beauty of the graphics somewhat undermines what I think is actually the thesis of the project, in terms of rethinking how one could live there. Because I think that, but I actually say that with love more than critique. In other words, I think the ambition is about really sort of preserving the historic character and thinking about how it can be reused. And so I think you need to, let's say, really think critically about how the existing architecture is how it works and how that informs how it looks. Because I think it's more than just the sort of imagery and the texture. And I think the comments about sort of wheelchairs on cobbles are very well taken. And I think that that's a really interesting place where you could try to negotiate that. I was going to say negotiate that terrain, which is terrible, but negotiate that sort of desire for texture and performance in a really sophisticated way, and then it would become something other than texture map. I was looking again. At the plan, as I promised, and I was like, where does that stair go? Right. And then it's like, okay, right, it goes to that sort of platform, which was about maintaining the one level height, but still creating this kind of ceremonial space, as I understood it, which I think is totally great. But it's also very much at odds with, like, that's a very tough stair to negotiate, even if you're not in a wheelchair. Right. And so I would ask, like, how do you get that space? How do you get that space to perform the way you want it to perform with regard to ritual, to respect the kind of height limit, or not, in one particular place, because maybe that's okay in one exception, and to work for the kind of constituency that you've identified as being the prime constituency for the project. Like, if I could sort of find like one small part of the project to kind of focus this discussion, I think it's that platform, because it's really interesting, and it's also kind of one of the most weird spaces. I mean that in a good way. It's also one of the most ambitious spaces. Just going to add that little addendum.
Michael just asked if I wanted to make some final comments and jump in. And I think that what is so fantastic about the comments is twofold. One is that it's great that the comments are being made at the scale of the design rather than the overarching ambition. We're actually looking, the critics are looking very specifically at the drawings, at the renderings, and commenting about the smallest of moments, which is, I think, really crucial, because then the design, rather than the concept, is really where the concept is being at stake and being played out. So, and so all the comments are totally apt, and particularly apt because of Zikong's trajectory over the course of the semester, which has just been a pleasure, because up until very recently, the geometry was definitely leading and controlling Zikong rather than Zikong controlling it. So it was fantastic that the initial engagement with, even as she did that axonometric drawing right from the beginning, and took apart the building, then she added, the general curves, and those general curves didn't have the ability, sensitivity, flexibility that the original components did. And so just to watch her start to be able to engage these in the level of what Michael said, at the level of the body and the use and the engagement, and also to not believe that there are things like curves or angles or right angles, but there are curving, angling, and right angling. In other words, they're inflected surfaces that could begin to inflect in relation to the life of this project and the interaction of its life with the existing architecture, which it tries to both emulate and evolve. I think is totally fantastic. And I know that she will hear all your comments about platforms and steps and cobbles and and rainwater, and immediately start to work on that over break, because in the last few days the project has grown and developed, even from the high state it was merely on Wednesday. So this is a great congratulation to Zikong in that regard.
Mark, that's a really welcome comment. because maybe not so directly, what I was alluding to is there's a sense of insecurity that architecture community kind of grapples with. And that insecurity is about willfulness and about formalism. We've always been either critical of each other or self-critical about being willful and addressing architecture from a formal approach. And there've been comments made about sort of ideas of the genius loci and critical regionalism. I want to shy away from the critical regionalism only because it carries so much weight and so much baggage. There's so much history associated with that. It's a very well-known term. I guess in some ways, I'd like to promote the idea of critical formalism, that architecture doesn't have to begin and from an intellectual point of view. Architecture doesn't need to be meaningful from the outset. Architecture can become meaningful through its own mechanism, through its own language, and through its own facility. The fact that we've shied away or almost hidden from the academic environment, that in fact, as architects or as artists, we do engage in formalism and a healthy level of formalism. And there is no such architecture, in my opinion, that is informal or that doesn't approach the constructs without any kind of formalism. So it's about embracing that as one of our assets and one of our tools, and it's about observing it and becoming kind of opportunistic as we are now. It's okay if it's post-rational. It's what's critical is that you're actually observing what's being made and you're letting that take on its own meanings. So I commend this project because as I noticed, it really started out with a very innocent kind of observation. It's an orthogonal structure, and I want to infuse it with something that is contrary to orthogonal, and geometrically speaking, it's the curvilinear. So it can start out that simple, and it's more about how it kind of evolves and how it's enriched during the many iterative processes and observations. And so I do like, I think that the imagery is amazing. The imagery itself is very poetic. And there's very it's very and it kind of speaks for itself. It doesn't necessarily need to represent a concept. It's its own concept.
I think what was so fascinating in watching Zikang over the semester is sometimes it's funny that you say speak for itself. I always say to the students that we're supposed to let the drawings speak for themselves, and I say, how dare they? They should only speak for Zikang and not speak for themselves. And the geometry at first was speaking for itself and her work, and not really able to be responsive to the social geometries and the social forms and formalisms that happen in the life of this particular place. So I think that what was great is for her to, and we sometimes confuse our sense that that curves are more flexible than right angles, whereas we know from the last couple of decades, we've had many very curvilinear buildings that are the most static. And to evoke a name that Harriet mentioned, you can have Cala Scarpa with many right angles that are much more dynamic than certain curved and more static buildings. But really, I always say that one doesn't have to vote between these. And in so many architectures, there's an ability to see that as Greg Lynn said many years ago, that this straight line is not curved. It just currently has zero curvature, and we can increase its inflection rather than its curvature. So the way in which even in just a few days ago, for Zikang to see that there's a combination in the existing architecture, both of the rectilinear and those slight curvatures of the roof, and to be able to see that her shelving could play between them was a great, and didn't have to choose between them, didn't have to choose between the orthogonal and the curvature, but could inflect in both directions. That was a big jump for Zikang, and a way to get the geometric form and the social form to play off of each other.
Thank you, Mark. Perhaps now is a good time, especially with respect to our schedule, to ask if anyone wants to make any final comments, not just on a particular project, but perhaps for our aspirations and realizations over the course of this morning.
I didn't realize I was unmuted. So I guess I'll just talk. Sorry. One of the things I enjoyed very much, we looked at 3 projects that were all architecturally incredibly strong, but also veered into landscape preservation, and planning. Not that they were landscape preservation or planning projects, but I thought that added a sort of a level to the discourse that I found really refreshing. I mean, because it's still an architecture review, but it was one of the things I enjoyed very much. There's also a sort of diversity of scale. And this is, as Mark was saying, we operate at the very large and simultaneously at the very small. I mean, it's, I guess, the joy of this type of review where we're getting a kind of cross section across, 3 studios rather than, all the work of one studio. But it really, that combined with having the sort of just the time to actually talk about a project for a full hour made this really wonderful. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Henry.
I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me. I always enjoy being part of these conversations. And I think that one of the reasons that I enjoy it, certainly over the last year or so, besides the fact that I don't have to get on an airplane soon enough, is that, I think that the students now, and especially here at the school, are beginning to make architecture from very different contingencies that I think we learned architecture in our generation. And they are beginning with, the realities of climate change. They're beginning with the realities of aging in place. They're beginning with the ways in which, we're going to have to remedy situations with, kind of existing materials and existing resources and so forth. And their speculative aspects have not been deterred by all of that, but rather they've become not just more plausible in their speculation, which I guess is a little bit of a contradiction, but also there's a kind of newfound, urgency in the work. And that sets off a number of propositions that are going to hopefully cause us to, continue to rethink what it is that architects do in the world, and why we do it. In other words, it's both, it's a pleasure to see the students work in this vein. But I also feel like the students are kind of 3 steps ahead of the reviewers or the jurors at this point, in terms of reconciling and understanding what the task is at hand. And I feel like there's a lot to learn from this generation of students, and I'm a little, as always, humbled by that by that experience, especially when it comes to my own work and my own practice. So I guess that's a thank you. But I hope students, you don't just take this as your opportunity to jump out into the world and and do what you have to do professionally, but also to disseminate this new form of knowledge, and to be proactive about publishing this new form of understanding what architecture's agency is and what architecture does in the world. And I'd love to see thesis book and and so forth, and the range of the projects that we saw even just in this morning, this morning, speak to again how really important dissemination of this kind of work can be. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dora. We're very much working on that, and perhaps soon we'll have an announcement about our new digital archive, at which we hope you can find not just this, but all the other exciting work from all our professors and our students. Thank you. Yama, would you like to say anything in closing?
I think I may have jumped the gun and already made some closing comments earlier. But no, it's wonderful work. I've always been very impressed with Pratt. I was privileged enough to be sort of one of the first hires at Pratt. This was back in the mid-90s by Thomas Hanrahan when he was at the time dean. I was apparently the first one he got to hire after being in place for a couple of years. So I spent quite a bit of time in the early sort of formation of the school, about 7 years. And I've unfortunately I haven't had the time to practice, or to teach, but being involved in these reviews is really refreshing. And it's great to see how Pratt has continued to evolve and develop. And I consider it one of the top institutions globally. And it's just, and it's always about the kind of, these schools and these environments are, I don't want to belittle the instructors, it's about the students they attract, right? And so I always tell people, go to the school that attracts an interesting student body, not just because you think they have interesting instructors. That's only part of the equation. It's it's so much about the culture that it cultivates. I know from personal experience, I learned at least as much from my colleagues, students, when I was a student, as I did from my instructors. I think Pratt is fostered an incredible culture, and it's continuing to evolve in really great directions. So great work.
Thank you, Yama. Zeri,
Yeah,
just a few years ago, you were on the other side of exactly this review, in person, of course.
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, I would like to thank all the students as well as the department for hosting me again. I mean, as alumni of the BR program and having done these kind of reviews many years ago myself, it's really good to see the continuations of the creativity and the integrity of the projects. And I guess what really struck me about all the projects today was the fact that even though they are speculative, but by speculative, they're not meant to produce fantasies, but rather by putting alternatives on the table. And I think the fact that architects, we have this kinds of unique sort of ability to to propose alternatives and forecast new kinds of working relationships with other stakeholders. And I think those are really important qualities of the project I see. And I guess I would just like to offer my encouragement for the students to keep working. But again, thank you so much, everyone, for having me.
Thank you, Zeri. And in closing, I think we'll hear from our dean.
Gosh, I was supposed to say far more clever things on time. I think that's not at all possible, because I think the quality of the reviewers' comments there has been really astonishing. Incredibly grateful for all of the sagacity and insight that we've had shared with students, and of course the students themselves who've offered some wonderful provocations. I certainly think, of course, that, how do we know whether knowledge is relevant? Well, we issue it to students in briefs and then see how they get on. And I think we certainly do that sometimes, given this challenge of testing whether or not our curriculum still resonates, whether on a theoretical basis or a practical one. And I think that the struggles that the students often find themselves in are very much, I think, the weather vane for the rest of us as to what we can perhaps do as writers and theorists, and also as practitioners, and certainly as deans and professors regarding the curricular steer. That becomes, I think, in many ways a feedback loop, more like a Mobius strip actually, but something that I think we value very much, and that's what these conversations certainly allow us to do. I think that Yama's point about evolution at Pratt is an interesting one, isn't it? Because what constitutes an evolution of a school, and it's often, yes, of course, it's changing people, but it's also a lot to do with the context in which we're operating and the seismic shifts we've all been subjected to. And of course, the Zoom environment for a review is illustrative of. So I think that, the way in which these projects all of them seem to want to confront some of the perennial challenges, but also some very contemporaneous ones, which I thought was very refreshing, and to not do that in at all reserved way, and to be entirely honest about those struggles and those challenges. And I think it's that honesty that's so important in the work, to not kind of obfuscate through renderings that communicate more about your stylistic capabilities than they do the integrity of the architecture. And I think seeing all of these projects presented in such a clear and direct way has been really encouraging and refreshing. And just overall, students, you are amazing. We are here because of you. You are, I know there's only like technically one student and a buddy, but just saying, you have to tell your mates whatever later. But it's that sense of being reminded in these situations as to the real understanding of what it is we're doing. And without this, without your work is very much this kind of important set of directives for us as to how, not only what we prescribe as your curriculum, but also how we might respond to it, and indeed as professionals what we might want to prioritize. So again, I know that you're technically proto professionals, but in many ways you are the future, and that's what you're revealing to us. And it's encouraging to see that the future looks a lot rosier than it did when I was a student. So thank you. And I think back really, obviously to Michael, to say the most profound thing ever, because apparently that's what you've got to do for the last person to speak, and then wrap up for the day. But just to thank all our critics who've been fabulous, or reviewers rather, and students, of course. So thank you all for coming and for your commitment and loyalty to the school and enduring support.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ashkan. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Zikon. And of course, to Dora, Henry, Yama, and Ziri. Thank you for everyone. And I imagine we'll see you in person very soon. Take care. Have a good weekend.